Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to INSS English Podcast. On the afternoon of June 1st, 1941, exactly 82 years ago, in the midst of celebrations of the traditional Jewish harvest festival holiday of Shavuot, murderous violence broke out against the Baghdadi Jewish community, with Iraqi civilians and law enforcement attacking men, women, children, babies, as well as Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues. Even though numbers of casualties suggest much higher numbers, official sources indicate 180 Iraqi Jews who were brutally murdered and thousands wounded and raped. This outbreak of mob violence against Baghdadi Jewry is a clear outcome of bestial and brutal anti-Jewish hatred, which is known as the Farhud, pogrom in Arabic, marking a clear turning point in the history of Jews in Iraq and in the history of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Anti-Semitism in the Arab world then and now. This will be the focus of our program today. What are the origins of this phenomenon when looking specifically at the Arab world? What are its main sources of influence? Are the origins of anti-Semitism in this region rooted in ideas from the West, or rather more in old Islamic traditions? Also, who are the main actors behind it, and what are their interests in fueling it further? What are the ways to combat anti-Semitic discourses in Arab countries, and also externally when observing the spillovers of this phenomenon in the West? Where would be a good place to start from? Contemporary anti-Semitism in the Arab world, an imported or rather a deeply rooted problem. INSS English Podcast. We begin right after this. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the INSS English Podcast, today dedicated to the subject of anti-Semitism in the Arab Muslim world. My name is Adi Kantor, and next to me in the desk today is Meir Litvak, professor at the Department of Middle Eastern History and a senior research associate at the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at the Tel Aviv University. Among his publications are the books From Empathy to Denial, Arab Responses to the Holocaust, published in 2009, and She Scholars of 19th Century Iraq, published in 1999. Meir, welcome to the program. This is really a privilege to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, a lot of questions on the agenda of this program today. Before we dive into the history, in order to understand the present, maybe we will start from the present, from a very recent example, from the speech of Palestinian leader of the Palestinian Authority, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas. He was quoted, when addressing the Palestinian legislative body, he was quoted saying the following: "The Jewish question that was widespread throughout Europe was not against their religion, but against their social function, which relates to usury, unscrupulous money lending, and banking and such," unquote. Clearly an anti-Semitic, pure anti-Semitic statement, which is clear, of course, to us sitting here in the studio, but unfortunately many are following these kind of statements and think this is true. So this is just an example from a few days ago. This is the question now, what are the roots, the origin of the development of contemporary anti-Semitism in the Arab world? Where would you point out, where would you pinpoint it? Where did it all start?
I would say that modern anti-Semitism in the Arab world is the outcome of the convergence of two processes. Mm-hmm. One, you can say, is traditional, pre-modern anti-Judaism in Islam as a religion, which basically saw Judaism as an inferior religion to Islam and found many faults in Jewish scriptures, also in the conduct of the Jews. This was traditional religious anti-Judaism. During the 19th century, it converged with a new trend, mm-hmm. which was the outcome of importation of anti-Semitic themes from Europe. And there was a reception to these imports because the Muslim world found itself in a major crisis. Mm-hmm. when Muslims were powerful and strong, they could afford to be tolerant toward minorities. They could look at them from above.
You mean the empire, for the Ottoman Empire?
Ottoman Empire and before. When Muslims felt threatened by modernity, felt threatened by Western economic and political and military power, they became less tolerant and they became more fearful to their status. Then ideas which explained their predicament, which explained why minorities all of a sudden enjoyed some advantages over them, were welcomed.
Yeah.
And we can see, for instance, first sign is 1840, the Damascus blood libel. Charge of Jews using blood for ritual purposes, which was brought by Christian monks to Damascus. But in 1894, for instance, we see the first translation of a rabid anti-Semitic book from German, Talmud Jude by Düring, which was translated to Arabic. That is before the advent of Zionism. We can see the reception of European anti-Semitic themes.
How do these kind of texts reach the Middle East at that time?
Middle Eastern, first of all, it was by Europeans who brought them, or Christians who were educated in the West, and then Muslims who were educated in the West, or were exposed to Western anti-Semitic ideology, discourses, and then brought them to the Middle East.
And they're translated into Arabic. Yes. And how many readers are to these?
Well, there are many readers. Again, especially in the 20th century, when Muslims find themselves in a real deep crisis after the 1918, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the last great Muslim empire in history. Most Middle Eastern countries are under European rule. Advent of Zionism.
Yes.
Middle Easterners find Arabs need an explanation why their predicament, and then they have the great solution. The Jews, and we now have documentary evidence. We have the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which are brought to Europe after 1918 and were translated to Arabic already in the 1920s, two translations.
They reach the Middle East only after World War I.
Well, the protocols reached Western Europe after 1918, and from Western Europe they reached the Middle East. The important point is that they became extremely popular in the Middle East and the Arab world. Since the 1920s to the present, there have been over 59 editions of the protocols published in Arabic and other Muslim languages.
What is the reason for that? How would you explain something like this?
59
editions.
When people are in predicament, when they have a crisis, when they can't understand reality, they are receptive to conspiracy theories that explain complex reality. Now everything is clear. All our problems, all our troubles are the result of a scheme by a devious, powerful group that controls everything. And now everything becomes very clear. It's not our fault that we are in such a big trouble. It's them. They are very powerful. What can we do against such a powerful enemy? And adopting anti-Semitism, by the way, is a very good way to absolve yourself from any responsibility to your faults and weaknesses. It's always the other, yes, exactly. And especially, by the way, it becomes more painful because the Jews appear more successful, especially with Zionism and so on. And the Arabs have a problem explaining how come the Jews, who had been destined by God to be punished and humiliated and pressed all over the world, dispersed all over the world, because they rejected Islam. How come the Jews are successful? How come 600,000 Jews can defeat 6 Arab armies in 1948? It's not because
we're just about to reach this year.
It's not the Jews because the Jews did something good. It is because they are devious, they are powerful, they dominate the whole world, and therefore we Arabs lost to such a devious, powerful force, and that explains reality, and you can feel comfortable with yourself and with your...
This is very familiar when discussing, of course, Western anti-Semitic discourses, and it's really one-to-one with what is happening in the Middle East, I would say, really from the first half of the 20th century. But, I mean, when you say the Jews, let's take, for example, the Baghdadi Jews. These were people who were Iraqi patriots. They saw themselves as part of the Iraqi community, the Iraqi nation.
Most of them, not all of them, by the way, most of them, but not all of them. But more important thing is the Iraqi Jews were westernized, much more westernized than Iraqi Muslims. Iraqi Jews received Western education. They received support from Jewish communities in Europe, schools like Alliance, like other, and therefore they were associated with the West, by the Arabs.
And this is a reason to hate also. And they're associated also with the British, for example.
And also because, again, of Zionism, all the Jews are Zionists. Zionism represents all the Jews. Then you mesh together the Iraqi Jews with the Zionism, with the Jewish worldwide conspiracy against Islam. And I would say that Iraqi society was not, you could say, this wonderful, I would say, tolerant society in the past. It was a problematic society to begin with.
Yeah, and then comes, of course, the Fahud, this chaos in 1941, which brings, I think, a lot of Baghdadi Jews in the end to arrive to the State of Israel in the beginning of the 50s. You mentioned, of course, 1948 is a crucial year.
Yes.
What is happening here in 1948, and how does it affect the anti-Semitic discourse, which is developing in a new path, I think, from that point on?
Let's start with 1947. In a unique case in history, both the Soviet Union and the United States agree on the partition of Palestine and establishment of a Jewish state.
Even though 1917, this is already in the Balfour.
Yes, but the Balfour Declaration is one power. Here you have the leader of capitalism and leader of communism agree on one thing. What do they agree on? On supporting a Jewish state. It must be a conspiracy. Okay? There must be a sinister force behind them, bringing them together. Then you have the 1948 war, and the Jews win. They defeat Arabs.
Yes.
They defeat the local Arab population in Palestine, and then they defeat Arab armies. How can you explain the fact that, again, 600,000 Jews were able to defeat 5 Arab armies? Either there's something deeply faulted in Arab societies, or the Jews are this very extremely powerful, sinister force that dominates the whole world, and then they're able to defeat us. And after 1948, Arabs need justification, explanation. First for the defeat, also, by the way, justification why it is necessary to destroy and exterminate Israel. You see, it's not only
Israel
us, the Arabs.
becomes now a new term
but
in
Israel,
the negative,
but Israel,
in the narrative.
they don't make a distinction between Israel and Jews. And
from that moment, already in 1948, it was clear Jews is Israel, Israel is Jews.
Anti-Zionism is part of, you could say, of anti-Semitic discourse. And again, it's not only us Arabs who hate the Jews. Look, the whole world hates them. The whole world wanted to destroy them, which shows you how bad they are, how evil they are, that Germans, French, Crusaders, and everyone else wanted to destroy them. So we Arabs are in very good company when we claim that Israel should be exterminated, the Jews should be kicked out, which we do to them exactly what others did to them in the past. And
yeah, a small question regarding this exactly. 1948, you see an increase, for example, in Holocaust denial. On the one hand, you say justification for this extermination of the Jews. On the other hand, denying it. Yes.
First of all, Holocaust denial appeared already in 1946 in the Middle East, but also in Europe. The closer we get to 1948, there is a great tendency to diminish the extent of the Holocaust. The Jews didn't suffer so much, and so on. Now, you can justify pogroms, expulsions, massacres of Jews, but deny the Holocaust as a policy that aimed at exterminating the entire Jewish people. Because if you accept the Holocaust, by the way, then you accept Jewish victimization.
Exactly.
Then you accept the idea that Jews did suffer, that maybe also the Jews are people, and therefore the Jews, God forbid, have some maybe justice in their claim. So you have to deny the Holocaust.
Claim for a nation.
Claim for nationhood and state, yes. They need a refuge. They need a place for refuge. So you cannot accept the Holocaust
because this will justify
such, because it will help Zionism. But at the same time, you justify persecutions, pogroms, etc., because the Jews deserve it. Okay, so they got what they deserved, but not enough.
And this is increasing more and more when you look in the 50s, 60s. We're just about to reach also 1967, which is a crucial year also in the discourse, anti-Semitic discourse. Is there any opposition to these kind of narratives in the years after the establishment of Israel? Do you see any voices that spoke against it? Or?
You don't see maybe voices speaking against it. What you see is maybe our silent voices.
Okay.
If you look, for instance, at let's say the most illustrious Egyptian authors, they did not utter anti-Semitic statements. Okay, so you can say that it was
the intellectuals are
no, some intellectuals. You could see also some leading intellectuals who were very much anti-Semitic.
Yes.
But if I would take, let's say, the 3 greatest Egyptian authors, Tawfiq al-Hakim, Taha Hussein, and Naguib Mahfouz, none of them made any anti-Semitic statements. So maybe they didn't agree with it, but they could not come out openly against it.
Why?
Because, by the way, in the 1950s and 60s, it received clear government approval. And you can see it in government newspapers, and you can see it in government electronic media statements. Even by Gamal Abdel Nasser himself denying the Holocaust. Later, by the way, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad and his son, both denying the Holocaust and justifying anti-Semitism.
It goes together normally.
So if if the president denies the Holocaust, who are you to challenge him and say that it happened? What you see, a new trend is in the 1990s.
We will come to this.
But not before.
This, of course. You refer, of course, to the Oslo Agreements.
Yes.
Okay, we were just about to reach that. Until now, we discussed many political events that are affecting the narrative. Is it closely interlinked, anti-Semitic discourse in the Middle East, depending on what is happening politically in the region?
It is very much influenced by what happens in the region, because every crisis, you need an explanation. Every conflict with Israel then exacerbates animosity toward Israel. Yeah. This is one thing. Or, for instance, to give you an example, you see a change in the West toward the Holocaust following the Eichmann trial.
Right, beginning of the 60s.
Yes, once the Holocaust becomes an important theme in Western culture and indirectly influencing Israel, then again for the Arabs there's a need to deny it.
So 1961, you see suddenly
is an important landmark. Is an important landmark because the Holocaust now becomes, you can say, a household name or figure in Western culture, and then the need to deny it or the need to justify it increases. Then 67, of course, 67 is important because 67 is not only a military defeat. 67 also marks the rise of Islamist movements in the Middle East as a major social, political, and ideological force. And the Islamic movements are vehemently anti-Semitic.
Can you talk about the place of anti-Semitism in these?
Anti-Semitism is an integral, central element of modern Islamist ideology because modern Islamists perceive Islam as under siege, under threat by Western offensive, and Islamists associate the Jews with the West.
They speak with America.
Yeah, with the West in general, starting, you can say, from Freemasons and the French Revolution, etc. Yeah. And you can say that both Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, a Shi'i Iranian, and Osama bin Laden, the most radical Sunni Salafist, both of them speak of what they call a Crusader Jewish offensive against Islam, going back for 1,000 years. So, and again, Islamists have a problem explaining the predicament of Islam in the modern period. Also, and another important point, Islamists always go back to the past. And the past is you have the conflict between the Prophet Muhammad and the Jews of Medina in the 7th century. Now everything is clear. The Jews have been waging a war against Islam from the time of the Prophet to this day. But just as the Prophet has defeated the Jews then, so we shall defeat the Jews now.
And this, you say, begins not before 1967.
No, it starts before 67, but it gets a major boost after 67.
Of course.
Sayyid Qutb, one of the leading ideologues of Islamic movements, in 1954 writes a book of Our Struggle Against the Jews, where he justifies Hitler and complains that Hitler did not do a good job. He didn't finish the job. So it appears before, but it became it received a major boost after 1967, became then much more widespread.
Also, of course, the protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Yes.
More editions, more translations.
Yes.
So what happens in the 90s? The Oslo Agreements, how do they influence the narratives?
The Oslo Agreements led some Arab intellectuals to the conclusion that if we Arabs want to accept Israel here, okay, whether we like it or not, it's there, okay? And if we really want peace with the Israelis, we have to understand Israeli psychology, Israeli anxieties, and so on, and therefore we have to understand the Holocaust, for instance. One thing. Secondly, some of these intellectuals, who I would say truly enlightened liberal intellectuals, care about the, you can say, deterioration of the Arab world. And they want the Arab world to be part of the modern world. And I'll give you an example. One of the such leading intellectuals, Hazem Saria, for instance, says, in the past, we Muslims we were supporting Alfred Dreyfus. We were on the side of the good guys.
The Jews,
Who are our friends now? Jörg Haider, the neo-Nazi, or other neo-Nazis? Do we want to be friends with such people like neo-Nazis? No, if we Arabs want to be part of the modern world, if we want to be part of modern humanity, then we must acknowledge the Holocaust, we must acknowledge anti-Semitism, we must stand against it, because
the Holocaust not only as a Jewish story, but as a universal
story,
human story.
Yes. And we have to understand that yes, the Jews were victimized, and therefore they are fearful or suspicious or behave the way they do.
Even though this means also to justify the establishment of the State of Israel.
They are not necessarily
Zionists. Understanding that there was a Holocaust.
That doesn't make them Zionists. Okay, none of them says, okay, we think the Jews have a right.
But they are separating Israel from.
But Israel is a fact.
Yes.
Okay, it's there to stay.
Okay.
and we have to accept it. One thing. Secondly, we have to accept the Holocaust as I could say, as a sign of humanity. And by the way, you can see it, for instance, nowadays in countries like the Emirates, who and Bahrain, who have a completely new approach.
They have a museum on the Holocaust.
Because they say we want to preach tolerance.
Yes.
We want to preach, when you can say, humanism
and religious dialogue. By
yes, and if you want to preach tolerance, and you want to be part again of modernity, you have to reject anti-Semitism. This is you could say, entry ticket to modern, universalist, liberal society.
So you can fight anti-Semitism and still be against the existence of Israel? Or
it's very tricky. It's complicated. If you say Jews don't have a right to statehood, and they are the only people who don't have a right to, that's anti-Semitism.
Exactly.
Okay? If you say that Israel doesn't have the right to exist because it perpetrates crimes, well, then 50 other states should not exist. If you, in a way, exclude Israel from everyone else by using different criteria to judge Israel, then in a way it reflects one thing. Secondly, sometimes you use themes against Israel which you can see clear borrowing from anti-Semitism. For instance, Israeli doctors harvest organs from Palestinians.
Yeah,
okay? You take the anti-Semitic trope of the blood libel and you attribute it to Israel. By the way,
this is happening. Do you see this as something that is very present in the discourse today?
It appears, for instance, in Iran. It also appears in Arab countries. By the way, also it appears in Germany. And
among
also in Britain.
communities.
Muslims and non-Muslims, by the way. Accused Israeli doctors going to Haiti that they didn't go actually to help the poor people of Haiti after earthquake, but to harvest organs and sell them for money, because Jews, always look for money.
It exists.
This is
conspiracy theories.
This is supposedly anti-Zionism, but in fact it reflects anti-Semitism, because when you use anti-Semitic tropes, or by the way, when you attribute Nazi characteristics to Israel, then when you equate Israel with Nazism, again, you diminish the Holocaust, you diminish Nazi anti-Semitism, you inflate Israel supposed crimes, and you deny Jewish victimhood. Okay?
Exactly. You see Israel as a perpetrator, but this comparison, where does it begin, Meir? This comparison between the state of Israel...
Already in 1945. Ahmed Shukeri, who was testifying to the Anglo-American Committee in 1945, says to him, and Meir Ben-Gurion, I hear Hitler. It's the same thing. And then it becomes more and more prevalent. 67, by the way, is the turning point, because until 67, the Arab press, and by the way, caricatures used to portray the Jews as this ugly creature, which also borrowed from European anti-Semitic...
From European traditions.
Yes. And after 67, there's a change. It is no longer the Jewish dwarf with a big nose, but it is the soldier. The brute soldier who... again, suppresses innocent children. Okay.
Yeah. So this comparison between anti-Semitic comparison between Israeli soldiers to Nazis also brings with it from 1967, of course, the occupied territories. Yes. The population in these territories are also compared to
Gaza
to Jews. By the way, compared to the victims.
Gaza is equivalent to the Warsaw Ghetto. The West Bank is the equivalent to the Warsaw Ghetto. The prisons of Al-Khayyam in South Lebanon, and by the way, Guantanamo are like Auschwitz. Now, let's say if Guantanamo is like Auschwitz, and Auschwitz was not so bad. Okay, it wasn't a resort, but it wasn't so bad because Muslim prisoners in Guantanamo don't starve, and they are not being gassed to death. So Auschwitz was not such a bad place. If you equate it with Guantanamo, Al-Khayyam, and Gaza is a Warsaw Ghetto, again, you don't see bodies of Gazan children lying in the streets with dying from famine, from starvation. Okay? So neither did the Jews die from hunger.
This is very, very disturbing, this kind of, because we know that how widespread it is in textbooks, in the education systems, here in our region, also far in countries and across the Middle East. Who would you say, now we're discussing today, who would you say are the main actors behind anti-Semitic narratives?
Today,
in
it
the
is
region?
by far the Islamic movements. They are the leaders of anti-Semitism in the Middle East, by far. And I would say also that their anti-Semitism is the most virulent and a genocidal anti-Semitism. And then occasionally you have journalists and writers who express anti-Semitic views. And you can see, by the way, what Abu Mazen was saying is a clear example
Leader
of
of the Palestinian Authority.
clear example of anti-Semitism. Again,
It began already in his doctorate, by the way. This is not a new phenomenon.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, for instance, when Bashar al-Assad explained to the Pope, John Paul II, when he visited the Middle East, Bashar al-Assad explained to him that Jews were evil throughout history, in the sense and their persecution in Europe was justified. So here again, you have the Syrian president justifying anti-Semitism.
So I mean, really, when we're trying to somehow to map the actors behind it, we see it in the level of Islamic movements, political movements, leaders,
some
institutions.
Some leaders, I would say radical leaders. Again, Bashar al-Assad, Abu Mazen, because you could say Palestinian grudge against Israel, and journalists and some writers, but again, it's difficult to measure many or few, but you can see the presence.
When we talk about the spillovers, I mean, it's interesting. We started from the influence of the West. When you look 100 years ago, how did the West or Europe through colonialism, process of colonialism, how did it affect narratives here? We see also vice versa, this phenomenon of what's happening here affecting spillovers of narratives that are growing here or rooted here, that are on the way to the West and being rooted there when discussing Muslim communities throughout Europe, in the United States. And
clearly,
what do you see happening? Who is affecting who?
Clearly, Muslim communities in Europe and the US are influenced by the Middle East. This is clear because the Middle East is the center of Islam. And again, here you have the largest movements. So, of course, they're influenced by writings and statements by Islamic leaders coming from the Middle East to Europe. Also, for instance, you had in Europe many preachers, prayer imams, who came from the Middle East and served in mosques in Europe.
They're rooted in Europe today.
Yes, and spread their anti-Semitic message on every Friday on the pulpit.
Yes, you told me in our pre-talk that this is where you see the most problematic.
Yes, I think that such people, yes.
What is happening in the mosques
yes,
today in
the
Europe.
mosques, and also, by the way, such people have, sometimes TV shows. Yusuf Qaradawi, the most popular TV show in the Arab world, is on.
You say TV, and I'm saying, what about
and
websites? Talk about today.
Websites and social networks, yes.
Social media.
Social media and websites and so on are extremely powerful in spreading anti-Semitic themes, much more, by the way, I think, than textbooks. Not that they're not important, but I think these are much more important. Now,
interesting, when you look at for example, a pupil, going to school, he's affected more by the social media, say, than from the book he reads in the classroom about Jews.
Yes. Now, another thing is that you have, in the West, some communities adopted anti-Semitism for their own reasons. For instance, the African American community
for the reason.
You see anti-Semitism within the African American community in the U.S. And also elements of European left. I would say, following the fall of the Soviet Union, they need another cause to fight.
Let's talk about this. You mean the Red-Green Alliance?
Yes, the Red-Green Alliance.
In the U.S. context. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more about this. What is the Red-Green Alliance with regards to anti-Semitic context?
You see a very interesting phenomenon that people who are supposed to be leftists find themselves in alliance with Islamists. Take a person like Judith Butler, who describes Hamas as a liberation movement, and she completely ignores Hamas' ideology regarding women, feminism, oppression of Christians in Gaza, and so on. Now, how can you explain it? People on the radical left all of a sudden endorse Islam. I would say two things. They are anti-West, they are anti-Enlightenment, anti-liberal, and anti-Zionists.
And yet they are interlinked with socialists in the West.
These socialists are, again, they are anti.
We're supporting, by the way,
are critical of
human rights and
supporting human rights, the question is where, not everywhere. They completely ignore, for instance, the plights of minorities in the Muslim world. They completely ignore the plights of by the way, I would say oppression of women in Arab countries or Muslim countries. They would have, I would say, a very selective conscience of which parties they choose to criticize. And I would say they share animosity toward, again, U.S. as the epitome of the West.
Against the U.S. establishment,
yes,
you mean?
Yes, and in this regard, Israel is associated with the West,
right.
and is seen as part of the West, and therefore it is Israel here, in a sense, is an easy target. But not, plus, you can say, I would say, latent anti-Semitic tendencies that are now given legitimacy by projecting them as anti-Zionism. Okay, maybe I grew up as a boy hearing about the Jews, but since it's not nice to speak against the Jews, I speak against the Zionists. Okay,
it became just another word for
yes.
Just to be more politically correct.
Yes.
We're not saying anything about the Jews. We're just saying the Israelis.
Yes, Israelis. Yes.
Yes. So, when looking at what happened here in our region, just two years ago, Operation Guardian of the Walls, 2021. Clearly, for all those who witnessed the media and social platforms, we saw an increase in anti-Semitism in, of course, the Middle East, but also, again, we talked about the United States, in Europe. What is your take about what happened here 2 years ago with regards to anti-Semitism in the Arab world? We saw situations that were not seen before.
Well, first of all, we have seen that every time there was an eruption of violence between Israel and its neighbors, you could see a rise in anti-Semitism. I'll give an example. In 1982, when the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, there were statements in the Egyptian press praising Hitler and so on. So you could see it also in 1987 Intifada and other events. So whenever you have direct clash violence with Israel,
in our region,
you can see in the Arab world rising of anti-Semitism, and of course it spills over to the West.
And I'm referring to physical attacks. For example, in the U.S. two years ago, there were literally people walking inside the restaurants asking, "Who among you are Jews?" This was unprecedented.
Yes, I agree. I think, again, it's a convergence of several elements. One is, by the way, I would blame Trump. When Trump in 2016, in a way, condoned indirectly, implicitly, the riots in Charlotte, okay? And when he, in a way, signaled to anti-Semites, you can do whatever you like, even though he has a Jewish son-in-law.
Anti-Semites from the right, you mean?
From the right, yes. One thing, and then anti-Semites from the left, again, are influenced by third world anti-Semitism from the Middle East. Now, there is a larger Muslim population in America, and because here there's a tendency that whatever, let's say, third world people do or say, it is forgivable. You can't blame them because they've been victims in the past. So it is perfectly legitimate for someone who came from Africa or the Caribbean or the Middle East to say whatever they want because they've been victims. So you have to understand them. You have to feel their pain.
This is the discourse in the U.S., you say?
Yes, I would say so.
I would say, by the way, as a researcher of Europe, this is very different than expressing, for example, these kind of things in Europe. Because of the history, I think, the fact that the Holocaust took place in Europe and not the U.S., you see it reflects also in the law, in what is allowed to say, and what is the criminal, what would be considered Holocaust denial, what would be considered. In Europe, I think the law enforcement is a lot more strict.
I think many European countries understand that anti-Semitism is a threat to Western democracy, and they cannot tolerate them. Also, you have to remember that Middle East Europeans witnessed Islamic terrorism much more frequently than, except 9/11.
By the way, also in the U.S. lately.
Yes, but except for 9/11, it was one major event. In Europe, you had several events, or quite a few events. So
Charlie Hebdo.
European, not everyone, but European statement understand that if you tolerate anti-Semitism, it starts with the Jews, but it will spill over to others.
Would you say the Europeans, who are the Europeans? Again, we are very generalizing. But is it in the mindset of Europeans that if you attack Jews, you attack the democratic spirit?
Not all, because you did say, when there was an attack in early 1980s, Jews were attacked by Palestinian terrorists. The French interior minister said they wanted to attack Jews, but they killed Frenchmen, which means Jews are not Frenchmen, and we can tolerate attacks against Jews, but not against Germans. So he didn't make the distinction. Or you could see that, if you take some person like Jeremy Corbyn, who claimed he was only anti-Zionist, not an anti-Semite, but he tolerated anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and he made some statements which clearly smacked of anti-Semitism. Again, radical leftists in Europe don't share this thing, but I would say that some of the, liberal and also some social democrats understand that, again, if you allow, rabid anti-Semitism to go free, it will eventually affect everyone else. Just by the way, is what happened in Europe in the 1930s.
Exactly.
Okay, it started with Jews, but ended with everyone else.
World War II, of course. Yeah.
And I think they understand it, and therefore they are much less tolerant.
This is a very, very big, disturbing phenomenon. We won't be able, of course, to solve it today. But where would you say, from the place of combating anti-Semitism in the Arab world, where would be the right place to start if you really want to make a change? Textbooks, social media. Where would you attack first?
Media and social media first, I would say. Again, I think they're more important than textbooks. They're more influential than textbooks. And also to try...
Restrictions of the digital platforms?
Restrictions or trying to fight them by arguments. I would also say that if you could send a message, yes, the Arab world is in a big crisis. You're not going to solve your problems by blaming everyone else or by blaming the Jews. This is not would be not an excuse, but a way to escape from your problems. You want to solve your problems, tackle your problems. Don't blame everyone else.
Do you see voices from the Arab world saying that?
I do see, yes, you do see such.
From who are the ones
again,
who are
some liberal intellectuals who explain that, again, yes, we have to face, poverty and ignorance and illiteracy in the Arab world. This is the way to solve our problems, not to blame everyone else. And yes, you do see it, and yes, this is the
question is how powerful, how much.
It's very, very difficult. It's extremely difficult
to influence mindset.
It's extremely difficult. It's an uphill battle, no question about it. But I don't think there eventually will be another way. Now, another thing is that, again, the Islamist ideology is not the solution to the problems of the Arab world. It is one of the problems of the Arab world, not the solution. And if Arabs understand it, then eventually, maybe, hopefully, the appeal of Islamist anti-Semitism will also decline.
Professor Meir Litvak, very, very interesting talk. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Interesting, disturbing issue, but I think it's important to discuss this and make it accessible also for our public, our English-speaking public, in and outside of Israel, who I'm sure is also very much interested in these kind of topics. Thank you very much for being here today, and thank you very much for our viewers and listeners, and see you in the next program.